I'm really pleased today to introduce Finn Ouweleen. Finn is an intern in the Predator Prey program. Finn's from Atlanta. He comes to us with a degree in biology from Carleton College, he earned in 2020. I'll say that Finn has been an indispensable person in the Predator Prey program. In addition to the new research that he's presenting today, he's perfect at getting things off the highest shelf in the Predator Prey program lab, and at safe capture and removal of any of the creepy crawlies who are kind of constantly trying to get into the room. So Finn's going to talk today about his work on camera trapping in the Florida Wildlife Corridor. And without further ado, I'll hand it over. You got one?
Yeah. Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Finn. I'm the intern in the Predator Prey program. The title of this talk is Who Goes There? And it's on the preliminary findings of the fauna that we're seeing in this potential corridor that I investigated. So the who is what animals are we seeing, and the there is in this potential corridor. This is a 6-hour internship sponsored by the Boca Grande community also. Come on now. Okay, so one of the focuses of the Predator Prey program is the Florida Wildlife Corridor. What this is, it's a conceptual map of a bunch of green spaces all throughout Florida, interconnected with the goal of maintaining these spaces so large roaming mammals like black bear and panther are able to move through Florida in ways that they would as if there were no humans here. There's the dark green already conserved lands, and then we have the light green opportunity areas is what we call them. And those include working lands and connect between the already conserved areas. So what we do in the Predator Prey program is we monitor our section of the corridor using what we call the Corridor Observatory, which is 3 different camera trap networks. We have one on station, one at the ranch, and then one at DeLuca. And with these, each of them has around 40 cameras and 40 audio recording devices. And we get a bunch of data that we can then start asking questions to better understand how those areas are functioning in the Florida Wildlife Corridor as a whole. Questions that we can start to ask are, which species are we seeing? How many detections are we getting as a sort of proxy for how active that area is? And then we can also start comparing the number of detections and patterns of detections between sites to better understand which locations and which species should we be focusing on. So what I wanted to do for my independent project was establish a new camera network in our observatory. And I wanted to include an ecosystem that we don't have a lot of data on, which is ecosystems heavily affected by humans. So I chose the Leisure Lakes neighborhood, which is in red here. It's northwest of Lake Placid. And here the color scheme is the same as the Florida Wildlife Corridor. So the light green are the opportunity areas and the dark green are the already conserved areas. As you can see, Leisure Lakes is a mixture of both, but we actually didn't have any data on what fauna were out here before my project. So that was one of the knowledge gaps that we were aiming to fill. If you knew how to fly a plane and also how to time travel, this is what you would see if you flew over Leisure Lakes in the 40s. By this point, there were cattle on the land, but besides a few footpaths through the scrub, that's all you would see in terms of human effect. And it was just mostly scrub. In the 70s, they were anticipating that people would want to start living here. So they started building roads and ditches. And even over the course of a few years, you'll see if you watch the roads, they get more numerous and the wetlands get smaller. And if you continue this trajectory all the way until now, you see that Leisure Lakes has become heavily fragmented with roads. And anything that used to be scrub is pretty much now flatwoods. This is reflected here. Major takeaway is just that it's mostly scrubby flatwoods and mesic flatwoods in Leisure Lakes. Something to pay attention to is this ruderal and paved category, which is in light blue. Ruderal is vegetation that's growing in highly disturbed areas. So this is where there's been clear cutting or at the sides of gravel roads, for instance. And then in Leisure Lakes, the paved category includes all of the roads from the gravel roads to roads that were paved in the 70s and are now decaying to roads that are used all the time and have been repaved recently. If you compare the habitat composition between Leisure Lakes and Archbold, this is what you're seeing. So on the x-axis, we just have habitat type, and then the percentage is on the y-axis. For the rest of my presentation, if you see blue, it means that that's Archbold, and if you see red, that's Leisure Lakes. So just takeaways here are that at Archbold, we have more scrub, more wetland. That makes sense because it's less fragmented at Archbold and there's less ditches. And then when you're looking at Leisure Lakes, you see that there's more flatwoods and then much more of this ruderal and paved habitat type. And it's really hard to overstate how big of an effect this fragmentation from the pavement is. It's everywhere you look, and it leads to some interesting qualities. So one anecdotal interesting quality that we see is a lot of gopher tortoises. We saw more gopher tortoises in Leisure Lake servicing our cameras than we do even on Red Hill. And we think that probably one reason we're seeing so many is that they're attracted to this vegetation that's growing in these highly disturbed areas and on the road margins. What these roads also are doing is causing serious fire suppression. So whenever there's a fire, it stops pretty fast because it can't spread. And also there's people that live out here, so there's no interest in doing burns. So the vegetation is thick all throughout the entire site, and it's gone long unburned. To show how long unburned it is, each of these with color are sites where we have some sort of history from FWC. And as you can see, even where we have history from FWC, there is no burn history in the majority of these. So that means that since 1900, there has been no written record of a fire occurring in any of these. The only fire recorded in my study site was a wildfire in 2017. So besides that, very little fire history. If you compare that to a place like Archbold, where we're trying to emulate a more natural fire history, you would see that a place is expected to have more of a mixture and heterogeneous history. And then also it should have things that are burnt much more recently than pre-1900. Another feature that Leisure Lakes has that I touched on a little bit is permanent human presence. So there are a few houses that you can see around here, but then also something to pay attention to is that there's these paths that cross multiple blocks and these huge highways of sand. And that is where people are taking their dirt bikes and ATVs. And we get evidence of them on the game cameras a whole lot. So there's definitely a lot of people just using the landscape out here. Where there's people, we're also expecting to see pets. So there's cats and dogs in Leisure Lakes. And then there's also more trash at Leisure Lakes because dumping is a huge issue. So you might wonder, why would I be interested in this place when it's just filled with garbage and dirt bikes? One major reason is because it might contain bears in a really vulnerable subpopulation. So the Highlands Glades subpopulation of black bears, its primary range is black in here, and Archbold is right here in the center. Leisure Lakes is circled in red, and it's on the western boundary of this primary range. Something else to note is that this black bear subpopulation overlaps a lot with the Lake Wales Ridge, which is in gray up here. And the Lake Wales Ridge would have been, before humans had a super strong presence on the landscape, it would have been a natural corridor for a lot of animals because it's this raised patch of land. And the fact that Leisure Lakes sort of straddles the barrier of the ridge, and on the west is surrounded by farmland and grazing land, and on the right is surrounded by ridgeland, on the east, that is, means that it could be serving as a sort of off-ramp and on-ramp to this highway or historic highway for animals. So in general, it's at this nexus point for a whole lot of species, especially the black bear. And this black bear subpopulation is really vulnerable with only around 100 individuals. If you compare it to a more healthy black bear population, like the ones that we have at Ocala St. John's, it's got much less natural habitat. The patches are denser, but they're smaller and they're all more fragmented. So this is just to say that this black bear subpopulation is really worth our attention because it's super vulnerable. Another thing that we were interested in at Leisure Lakes was maybe the potential to see foxes. So Jim Lane was on station starting in 1954, and he was taking notes. And until 1988, every year he noted at least one gray fox sighting on station. And if you ask people that were here early in the 2000s, they would tell you that they also saw gray foxes on station or at the ranch. And Jim Lane's recordings of gray foxes stopped in 1988. And now we've had camera trap networks out at the ranch and on station for a few years now. And we have gotten no detections of gray foxes and only a few detections of red foxes. So clearly there's evidence suggesting that the fox populations have gone down or have moved. So we were interested in seeing, going back, people in suburban areas often even now will report that they do see red foxes. And I myself have seen red foxes in Leisure Lakes and in similar suburban areas. So they're still here, just maybe more in suburban areas. So we were wondering, if we go to Leisure Lakes and have camera traps, are we going to start seeing foxes? And might these suburban areas be sort of a refuge that the foxes are using? The coincident with the decline in the fox populations is the expansion of the coyote range. So here's a map in the same year that Jim Lane saw his last gray fox on station. And at this point, frequent reports of coyotes were only in the north of Florida, with a few scattered reports throughout. Now, every day on our cameras, we're getting pictures of coyotes, and they're a firmly well-established part of the ecosystems here. And so we think that what might have happened, along with some other factors like disease potentially, but it's possible that the coyotes are taking niches that the foxes would be filling. So we were wondering, if we put cameras in this more suburban area, are we going to see more foxes and maybe less coyote? And are these areas acting as a sort of safe haven away from coyotes for foxes? So we wanted to approach leisure lakes as a sort of unexplored system because there's not a lot of data about what fauna is out there. In fact, like none. So when people are using camera trapping to explore regions that don't have a lot of information, what they do is they deploy a wide array of cameras and try to cover as much area as possible to get a snapshot of what animals are there. So that's just what's happening in these more remote regions where people are camera trapping. And so we aimed to do the same. So this is an aerial shot of leisure lakes. We have a 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer grid in blue, and then we deploy one camera in each grid cell, and those are the red dots. And so that means that we deployed 9 cameras in leisure lakes. This methodology mirrors what we have already at Archbold, and that makes it easy to compare the two. So I just subsampled the 19 cameras that were already at Archbold's as part of our station network, and was able to make comparisons between that and my Leisure Lakes network. For reference, when I say camera, this is what I'm talking about. It's just a post with a metal box and a game camera, and the game cameras are motion activated. So this is the time frame of my study. So when I'm talking about any results, just remember that it's all just from data occurring in these 3 months, pretty much, starting in early May and ending in early August. This was during the wet season, and it counts for 2,402 trap nights. In camera trapping, trap nights is just a way to quantify your camera trapping effort. So essentially, it's the number of cameras we have multiplied by the number of days that they're out there. Now we're going to get a little bit into the preliminary results. So here's a Venn diagram showing what species we saw at both sites. On the left, we have Archbold, and on the right, we have what we saw at Leisure Lakes. Notably, any species of mammal that we saw at Archbold, we also saw at Leisure Lakes. And the only major differences in what we saw were a bunch of bird species that we saw at Archbold that we didn't see at Leisure Lakes. Something to note is that we didn't see any turkeys in Leisure Lakes, which is interesting because I would have presumed that they would be there. Also, something to look out for is that we saw, this is just in the time frame that I'm talking about, we saw sandhill cranes at Leisure Lakes, but not at Archbold. And we think that this circles back to those edge effects that are attractive to gopher tortoises are probably also attractive to sandhill cranes. When you do a comparison of how many species we actually detected between the two sites, it is significantly different, where Archbold has significantly more species that we saw. And when you compare the activity levels of the cameras at the two sites, you also see that Archbold was more active. So on the y-axis, we have the standardized number of detections per hour. And this is just showing that the cameras at Archbold were busier in any given hour than they were at Leisure Lakes. This graph looks complicated at first, so I'm just going to orient you, and there's going to be a few that are similar after it. So what this is just the daily activity pattern. In this case, it's just for rabbits, and it's clumped for both sites. So on the x-axis, we have the hour of the day going from 0 to 24. And then on the y-axis, we have the percentage of detections. And we're using percentage of detections as a proxy for activity because you can assume that the more active an animal is, then the more detections we're going to get of it. And the takeaway for this specific one is just that in the middle of the day hours, at both sites during the entire study period, we didn't see any detections of rabbits, which makes sense. Rabbits are not going to be very active in the middle of the day. But we want to be able to compare activity patterns of animals between sites. So what we can do is split it by site. This is now for all species, not just rabbits. And any given point here represents one camera. So for instance, this point here is saying, okay, what were the percentage of detections for this camera, pretend it's like Archbold 11 or whatever, at this hour, the 11th hour. So what we're seeing already, and this is with a pretty small sample of data, it's only a few months, we're seeing that there's differences in the activity levels at the 1, 3, and 11 a.m. hours, where the animals at Leisure Lakes appear to have higher levels of activity. One possible explanation for this is that there's a big difference in how humans are using the landscape between these two areas. So here's just the human activity pattern. Archbold, there's an early start in the day, and then there's a huge spike where people are really present in the field, and then it sort of pitters out as the rest of the day continues. And then in comparison, at Leisure Lake, there's a later start in the day, but it's pretty consistent. And then there's a peak late in the evening, and people are more active all the way through the night. So this might explain why we're seeing animals at leisure lakes more active towards sunrise, because it's possible that they're waiting for the humans to go to sleep, which takes longer. And it's also possible that at Archbold, the animals are anticipating that there's going to be a human presence early on. So leading up to sunrise and after sunrise, they're not going to be as active. Getting into some summary of the species that we saw and what percentages. On the y-axis, we just have the percentage of detections. This is just for leisure lakes. And the takeaway here is just that the heavy hitters are deer, rabbit, and armadillo. That's the majority of what we saw in leisure lakes. When you compare this to the percentages of detections that we saw at Archbold, you can then go in and say, okay, which species did we have a significant difference in the number of days of detection for between the two sites? And when you do that, these are the results you end up getting. So circled in red here are the species. There's only one, which is the gray squirrel. That's the one that we saw significantly more days of at leisure lakes. And that makes sense because leisure lakes has a lot more flatwoods compared to Archbold. And then for the species circled in blue, these are the species that we saw significantly more of at Archbold. So those include the jay, the turkey, the raccoons, the bobcat, the pigs, and then the bear. Even though we saw significantly less days with bears, we still did, it's kind of dark, sorry. We still did see bears in leisure lakes. So we saw a mom and her two cubs. And we also saw four, because then there was also a male that we saw. Oh, three, there's three here, yeah. But this is 3/4 of all the bears that we saw at leisure lakes. We also saw 0 foxes, and we saw plenty of coyotes. So it's not looking like it's a safe haven away from coyotes for foxes. People, including me, will still tell you they saw foxes out there. So we're kind of wondering, where are they? Are they only around people's yards or something like that? And why are they more present in the suburbs? So just going into summarizing all of these results that I'm talking about, leisure lakes in comparison to Archbold had fewer species and fewer detections. We're seeing differences in the activity patterns between the two sites. And then we're also seeing less of certain species or fewer of certain species at leisure lakes, those being the bear and the bobcat and the raccoon and the pig. And then we're seeing more squirrels at leisure lakes. Now, taking these raw results and starting to make a little bit of conjecture and putting them into the broader scope of things, it might mean that leisure lakes just has fewer animals. And that would make sense given how fragmented it is and how strong of a human effect there is. And that would explain why we're seeing so many fewer detections. It also is looking like activity levels are adapting around the human presence, because the human presence has a significant effect across the board around the world on how animals are spending their time. So the differences that we're seeing between these two sites might be related to that. And then also, we can say that it's possible because leisure lakes is seeing less of these heavy hitters like black bear, raccoon, and bobcats. It's possible that there's lower biodiversity and lower resilience in leisure lakes. So zooming out some more and talking about what I mean when I say lower biodiversity and lower resilience, here's just a super simplified food web for what you would expect at a place like Archbold. And you can simulate what we would expect at leisure lakes by just taking out the species that we saw very rarely in leisure lakes. So if you take out the bear and the bobcat and the pig and the raccoon, and then you add humans, this is a cartoon of what we might expect to see at leisure lakes. So what's notable is that there's no high-level predators like bear or panthers. So any of the mesocarnivores, these mid-tier carnivores like the coyote or the possum, are going to have less control on their populations, and therefore their populations we might expect would be different. And then also the human presence adds mortality through roadkill and hunting, but it also adds new food resources through things like cat food and garbage left out. This is all to say that generalists are going to probably do better here, just because they're going to be able to take advantage of these new food resources and also take advantage of these holes in the niches left by things that aren't there as much. All of these conclusions should be taken with a grain of salt, because in camera trapping, it's a notorious issue to be able to make a one-to-one comparison between detections and abundance. And you would require a lot of statistics and arguing to be able to ever be like, okay, yes, a detection is always a metric equally of abundance. Also, there's different camera models between the two sites. So if there's a difference in how sensitive they are to each other, that would need to be accounted for when you're making comparisons. And then finally, I'm sort of saying that the habitat type has these effects on the fauna composition, and is the reason, and it's because of humans that there's these different habitat types, and that is why we are seeing these different amounts of the animals. But what is possible is that the animal differences aren't actually in the amounts, but just how the animals are moving through the ecosystem. So for instance, at Archbold, where we see less trees in the scrub compared to leisure lakes, we see raccoons on the ground a lot. And at leisure lakes, it might be that the raccoons are just in the trees more often. So we would get less detections of them and then falsely conclude that there are less raccoons out there. So it's important to remember that camera trapping is just one sampling method, and you can't really make a whole lot of conclusions just based off of that. Looking to the future, we plan on leaving these cameras out here and have been since I stopped punching the data for the few months that I had. So in red is just the time frame that we had data for leisure lakes, and then in blue is how long we've had cameras at Archbold. As you can see, the amount of time we've had cameras at leisure lakes is a small fragment of how long we've had stuff out at Archbold. And Archbold's camera trap network is relatively young in terms of long-term camera trap networking. Also, we can expand what data we're getting. So by attaching acoustic recording devices, we can start to get information on what insects and amphibians and birds are out there. And we also can get data on how much noise pollution is out there, which would be really interesting given how much human activity is occurring in leisure lakes. We can also look at other sites. So on the west here is Leisure Lakes. This is Lake Wales Ridge over here. And on the east side are similar looking sites that are super fragmented and these mixtures of conserved and opportunity areas. So if we can start new camera networks here and make comparisons to Leisure Lakes, we can start to say, okay, are there similarities that these have where we can start making generalizations about what we would expect in these hyper-fragmented ecosystems? And if they're not the same, then we can say, okay, we need to keep looking at these in a case-by-case basis. And in the near future, we plan on deploying a camera trap network in the Sun and Lake South neighborhood. Something else to look forward to and be excited about. These are species that we get very rarely at Archbold, and it would be a really big deal if we got any of them in any of these more suburban sites. And I would like to just end by saying, it's really easy to hear me say that Leisure Lakes has less animals, less detections, less going on, is probably less resilient and less biodiverse, and just to sort of write it off and be like, perfect, it's a scary, weird place full of scary people on dirt bikes, and it's not a priority. It's not really functioning as a healthy corridor. And all of that is true in part. It isn't really doing very well as a corridor, and it's missing a lot of species that we would like to see. And it also is very scary if you're a raccoon out there. But yeah, it's kind of missing the point because this area, I'm one of the only people that have done a project in this area, and it's super understudied. And it's a really cool isolated lab of where human effects are affecting wildlife. And as more people grow in Florida, we're just going to have more places like Leisure Lakes, so we ought to be paying attention to it. And to ignore Leisure Lakes is to ignore the fact that animals are behaviorally and evolutionarily adapting to our presence, which is really cool to watch in real time. With that, I would just like to thank a bunch of people, including Live Wildly, who funded a lot of our program, and also the Boca Grande community for sponsoring my internship. And then everybody else, you know who you are, that played an important role. And I just would like to say thank you all for my time here, and I'm glad I'm staying as an RA. And I would like to acknowledge that this occurred on Miccosukee and Seminole land. And with that, I would love any questions.
I'm going to try to attempt to walk around with the mic here so that folks online can hear the questions. So if you have questions for Finn, now's a good time.
Right, great talk. I was just curious about setting up the cameras, and particularly like how you choose where they go. Because I imagine you want to set them up in sort of an open area so you can get a nice shot. And I wonder what kind of bias that may be against maybe some animals that would never go in those open areas, particularly if you're trying to get a fox.
Yeah,
that won't go in those open areas.
I think that might be one reason why we're not getting foxes or certain species like flying squirrels. So I think usually when we're deploying them, we look for trails where there's a lot of activity, and we can look at the tracks and be like, okay, there's a bunch of different species represented here, so we can anticipate that we would see them, and it's like a pretty good sample of what we're getting. But yeah, I don't think there's a lot of information on how foxes are using these game trails, and maybe they could just be going around or something like that. And that's kind of why we would like to leave these out, because eventually in camera trapping, if you have them out long enough, you'll get everything that's out there. You just have to leave it out long enough. Eventually you'll get it all.
More questions for Finn?
Very good talk, Finn. Can you hear me? Yeah. So that's a very patchy acquisition site.
Yeah.
And, it's always a real quandary. What do we do with these mega parcels, as they're known, where it's like 30, 40, 50% acquired and then the rest open to development? One thing I was curious about, and I don't think you could structure your cameras to have them in and outside conservation lands, but I did notice, if you kind of ignore the roads, that there were big blocks that were further distant from houses and closer to houses. So did you see, looking at some distance, the nearest human habitation as a factor? And or I think for the Fish and Wildlife Commission, it would be really interesting to just scrape these and say, this is what we found on conserved lands, this is what we found on not conserved lands that are available, just to keep the argument going. It's worth continuing to buy these.
Yeah, I think it's hard to tell even when you're out there the difference between what's conserved and what's opportunity. And from the map, yeah. But I think that you're right. It would be, if we were able to conserve all of it, then we could break up these roads and start making it look like how it used to look. And it would be really interesting. And I think with more acoustic data, we would be able to do better studies looking at the distance from human activity and what that is affecting the detections. Because it's not like sound moves universally through an ecosystem. So just because there's one place that's closer to houses doesn't mean that it's going to have the same effects as someplace that might be farther away, but has a road all the way through, so the sound is traveling more. But yeah, there's a lot of ways that humans are interacting with the landscape that we don't have a lot of data on. And it's not just cars and stuff too, there's people walking around, and we got people walking in front of our cameras even that were away from roads. So yeah, in general, it's kind of like there's a lot of interesting interactions happening that we're not getting data on that we should be.
Just to build on that point, you spoke to some of the limitations of camera trapping as a sampling method,
Mhm.
but it still seems to me as like one of the more comprehensive ways to survey fauna in a certain region. I was wondering if you could speak to kind of what the other sampling methods are and what their strengths and weaknesses are.
Yeah, people used to do a lot more track surveys where they would just go look and see what tracks they're seeing. I think now camera data is a lot more useful because it tells you when the animal was there. But the audio recording devices add a whole new dimension to it because it's giving us a lot of data about species that we don't get on camera. But yeah, I would say that camera trapping is one of the initial ways, but it also is really limited because it's only on terrestrial animals. And there's a bunch of different ways that you can modify camera traps to look at other places. But it's sort of one of those things that just is like a really quick, nice to meet you to the fauna, and like to figure out generically what's happening. And then you can go in and sort of you could do walk surveys too, where you just walk and count what you see. But animals are scared of us, so it's better when we're not there to get data on them.
Any questions on the left side of the room?
Were there any instances of humans messing with the cameras?
It's a great question. We were super worried about that, and they're all double locked more than we usually have them locked up at Archbold. But we never had any instances of people messing with the cameras, which is why we feel comfortable in leaving them out and putting out some new ones. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it would be really interesting. I don't know if this is possible, but there might be a way to figure out the density of insects just based off how much noise you're hearing, which would be really interesting to be like, okay, this area has way less insects. I mean, maybe it's only notable if there's like a very significant difference, but even that would be really notable because that's kind of the base of the food web.
Really great presentation. I loved your graphics. I thought it was like really easy to understand. So
great job. This could be applicable for a lot of like like a community talk or something like that, I think. Um, and I was wondering if you have any land management recommendations for these spaces to make them be more habitable to more species.
Yeah, I mean, ideally, we would be able to just tear up all the roads and start burning it. In reality, there are some sections where we own both sides and the roads are in it, but I think that it's all mostly owned by FWC. I think there's a little bit of reluctance just because there are people out there and doing burns is sort of a high profile activity. So I think right now we're just kind of sitting on it. But yeah, it would be good to get burns started in there. And I think there has been some talk of that occurring.
My memory was that there were a series of wildfires out there. And in fact, it was pretty clear we had an arsonist out there at one time too. So I was surprised when you said there were no records of burns, because I'm almost sure there were intermittent, for 2 or 3 years, there were like all these intermittent wildfires out there. And I wondered if they're just not getting mapped effectively.
I think that's what's happening.
Because there was definitely, I mean, I think they were looking for an arsonist out there. It was so frequent.
Yes, please. It was you.
I don't I don't know if you're dreaming the arson or not, but we did digitize the last 10 years of all of FWC's management records, and it's sitting on the GIS server. So we could go look and see if those records, it would have had to been in the last 10 years. I think we went from 2012 forward. So if you're,
Those are from FWC.
yeah, because Julie like took all of their like hand maps and digitized them. Okay, darn.
Yeah, for sure. You can see a little bit of patchy burns, but none of them are even plot size, I would say.
You mentioned that the coyotes, I think, were coming in more in recent decades than they had been in the past. Do you
Mhm.
know kind of why that was happening and why they're doing so well as opposed to the foxes and things?
Yeah.
Changed.
I think there's been a lot of talk about this because in terms of range expansions, it's really rapid, just a few decades. Because there were at one point like no coyotes in Florida, and now they're everywhere. I think potentially there was diseases that wiped out or left fox populations weaker, so the coyotes could kind of slide into that niche, and just body them out. And then also I think like the presence of humans and stuff might be more conducive to coyotes compared to foxes, and people also like hunting foxes and stuff like that. But yeah, there's kind of a lot of talk about that. Of coyotes. Yeah.
I'll just add that historically, this area would have been inhabited by red wolves,
Mhm.
Which are native to the southeast and have been hunted out. And so there's an available niche for a large to mid-sized canid predator.
Yeah.
That coyotes are very good at exploiting. Also, it's a naturally kind of grassy, open landscape.
Yeah, I think also all of the ranching is
Yeah.
making it more similar to what coyotes are used to out west.
Okay. Any further questions? Thank you all so much for coming. I'm not sure when they dropped in.